So Gary Haugen, the president of International Justice Mission, said, "Nothing happens just because we are aware of modern slavery, but nothing will ever happen until we are." So with that said, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker. Libby Swenson serves as the National Partnership Director of International Justice Mission and the campus ministry Cru. She's going to provide us with the stats and facts, shock and awe, basically introduce us to a greater detail, I think, than most of us are aware of this problem defacing human dignity. She speaks on campuses all over the country, really shocking people that this is a reality here, not just in a third world country, not just an ancient Greco-Roman problem, not just in the antebellum South. Slavery is not dead in America, and neither is a particular form, sex slavery. It is alive and well. Libby lives in Colorado. She has 2 stepdaughters and is married to Bob Swenson of the former Orange Crush. Now, for many of you, that does not even make sense. You don't even know what that is. I'm going to leave that for her to tell you. Her talk is Injustice, Human Slavery and Sex Trafficking. Please welcome with me Libby Swenson.
Thank you, Corey. Yes, I'm very, very excited to be here. And let me tell you about the Orange Crush. For those of you that may not know, it was the defense for the Denver Broncos. And I brought tonight a real jersey. The real size, not the fake skinny ones that I don't know who can wear those. But this is a real jersey right here. This jersey was worn by my husband, Bob Swenson, who played for the Denver Broncos for 10 years. And so this is what a real jersey looks like. And I'm not even kidding. I think you could fit all of Bilbo Baggins' family in this whole thing. And not only that, these things are heavy. And I'm like, how did these guys do it? How do they run so fast with these heavy jerseys, with all these pads underneath? No idea. But hey, I thought about wearing it, but it's so ridiculously big that I truly look like an idiot. And I think my husband would kill me. But I'm so thankful to be here tonight. I certainly consider it a privilege. Thank you for coming out in the snow. As Corey was saying, I'm from Colorado. My husband, Bob, and I live out there. And just in the last 24 hours, we've gotten about 2.5 to 3 feet of snow at our house. So I'm like, oh, look, snow again. I feel like everywhere I go, it's snow. I'm ready to get to the beach one of these days. But tonight, I'm not going to spend all night bragging about the Broncos and my husband. I want to talk to you about some real issues that are going on right now. So thank you for coming tonight, because I think what you're saying is that you care about this because you're sitting in your seats tonight, that you took a Friday night as a student or as a professor or as a community member, and you said, I want to learn more about injustice and what's going on in the world. So thank you for being here. I'm very honored to be with you. Suhana was only 16 years old when she was rescued from a brothel in India. She was rescued by IJM at 16 years old, and she was taken to an aftercare place where she was amazingly healed and restored. And after a year of being in aftercare, Suhana and her aftercare workers decided that she was ready to actually get a job outside of the aftercare center and find a job in the city. So that's exactly what she did. So Suhana found a job. She was very excited about it. And in this job, she made several friends. Well, one of these friendships had terrible consequences. And would you believe that this so-called friend of hers actually tricked her? He betrayed her, and he sold her to a trafficker, who then again re-trafficked Suhana, to a city far, far away, where she again had to face the nightmare of being raped and abused and exploited day after day and night after night. So what is going to happen to somebody like Suhana? She represents millions of people, millions of women today who are being sold for profit, raped for profit. Well, tonight I want to talk to you about one of the greatest injustices that I think exists in our world today, and that is the injustice of human slavery. And the two organizations that I work with are both very committed to seeing an end to human slavery. The first is International Justice Mission. It's a wonderful organization that's based out of Washington, D.C. It's a human rights agency that is comprised of attorneys, criminal investigators, aftercare workers, and advocates in the community who are helping to end modern-day slavery. And here are some of the ways that that's done. I don't know if you'll see it on the PowerPoint, but it's done through victim rescue and through bringing criminals to justice. So perpetrator accountability is what we call that. It's done by restoring survivors like Suhana when she was in an aftercare. But then it's also about strengthening the justice systems, because what you'll learn tonight is that one of the major problems with human slavery in the world today is simply the rule of law is not being enforced. IJM was founded in 1997 by Gary Haugen, and so I'm working with them to help raise awareness about this problem of modern-day slavery, because we believe that this problem can end. But I also work with Cru, as Corey was saying. I've been with Cru for a very long time now, and so I'm working on campuses, and we basically are talking to people about human slavery and why this matters so much to God. So I don't deny the fact that we are actually both Christian organizations, but I believe that people from all kinds of beliefs and backgrounds are motivated by a sense of doing what is right. And I love what Martin Luther King Jr. said. He said this, and you're probably very familiar with this quote. He said, "Justice denied anywhere diminishes justice everywhere." There's another passage found in the Bible, actually in the Old Testament part of the Bible, and it says this. It says, "Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless and plead the case of the widow." I don't know if anybody said it better than Desmond Tutu. He said this. He said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have actually taken the side of the oppressor." If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse, and you look at that mouse and you say, "I'm actually neutral about this situation," that mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. Thank you, Desmond Tutu, your great wisdom. Well, I want to talk for just a couple of minutes is what do we mean when we're talking about injustice? And this is how we define it with IJM. And actually, we define it as an abuse of power. To take from others their life, their liberty, and their dignity, the fruits of their love and their labor. So injustice is actually an abuse of power over other people, taking away from them what is rightfully theirs. That's what we mean by injustice. But on the flip side of it, I like to think of justice meaning this, that it's actually the mandate of God that we give to others their life, their liberty, their dignity, and the fruits of their love and their labor, because we have that power to give that to them. Justice is the mandate that all men and women and children have the right to flourish today. Everybody has the right to live with dignity and with freedom and to live out their God-given abilities to do what they should rightfully be able to do. But as we know, that is not the reality for many people. And you know, for me, this reality of injustice became a stark realization for me when I was a college student. So my journey in understanding what all of this meant and means today started for me at kind of when I was your age. I was 22 years old. And I remember I had a friend that was living overseas, and they had been living there for a long time, and they had asked me if I could come and live with them for the summer and work in an orphanage. And I was super, super excited about it because I just kind of had in my mind this idea of what it was going to look like getting to go overseas and work with an orphanage. I was thinking, I get to play with kids, and we'll sing songs together, and we'll play games, and we'll do all of these really fun things. That was my vision of it. But what was in store for me was something entirely different. And I will never forget the day I got to this city. My friend and I, actually that day, we hopped on bicycles and we rode our bikes to this orphanage. And I remember going through these alleyways, and there's chickens and ducks and pigs everywhere. There's little places to eat. And I just even remember the smells, and we're riding our bikes down to this orphanage. And I remember seeing before me just a large gate. And that gate, unbeknownst to me, was a door that led to a life that I never knew existed. So we went through this gate, we hopped off our bikes, and we went into the orphanage. And the first thing that just absolutely overwhelmed me was just the stench. It smelled so bad. And the reason was I looked over, and there was a latrine running right through the center of the orphanage with just raw sewage going right through it. And I looked around, and I just saw children everywhere. And what they had done is they set these little children on these little tiny flower pots. And what they would do is they would just cut a hole in their pants, sit them on the flower pot, and they sat there all day long. They didn't know how to walk. They were never going to get any type of education. And I remember looking to the left, and I saw two little blind boys. And they had set them in these little wooden high chairs. And they had carved a hole in the seat of the high chair, cut their pants, set these little boys in this chair, and they sat there all day long. And they were blind. And they even tied their wrist and their ankles to the chairs. So they were just sitting there like this all day long. And it didn't take me very long to think, okay, and to realize we're not going to be playing a lot of games this summer. There's not going to be a lot of the fun that I was hoping I was going to have. This is a reality. I didn't know about this. But my friend said, well, I've got somebody else that I want you to meet. And so we literally stepped over this latrine, and we walked back to this little room. And so we opened the door, and what I remember is that it was very cold. It was really dark, and I looked to the left, and I saw a crib right there, and it had no mattress on it. And then there were ropes on the floor, and I thought, what are ropes doing on the floor? And I looked at the back wall, and there were big barrels with water and buckets and mops and brooms and faucets, and I thought that she had taken me to the janitor's closet until I looked to the right. And when I looked to the right, I just saw this black mass against the wall. And I literally did not know what it was until my friend went and picked up what was a little girl. She was so covered in flies and in dirt that I didn't even know it was a person. And she picked her up, and she turned around, and she handed her to me. And she said, welcome to your summer. And thus was my introduction to Ruthie. And I've got a picture of Ruthie here. Ruthie was left at a train station a few months before I actually got to the orphanage. They didn't know what to do with her at the train station, and so they took her to the orphanage. Well, Ruthie had some form of cerebral palsy, and she drooled out the side of her mouth, her eyes crossed, and as a result, the workers at the orphanage were afraid of her. They thought that she was probably contagious. They believed that her karma had actually gotten her to this state in life, and so she had probably done something bad. So what happened was nobody wanted to touch her. She became an untouchable. So they just put her in this room all by herself. So my work every day was to go to the orphanage and give dignity to Ruthie. Believe it or not, Ruthie was 15 years old. And I stand at about 5'1.5", and Ruthie came just a little bit above my waist, and she weighed about 35 or 40 pounds. She was being starved to death. So my role then was to go and feed her and take care of her. So every day I would ride my bike to the orphanage with a basket with food and soap and washcloths and all kinds of things to help take care of this little girl. But I remember one day I went around the back side to give Ruthie a bath, and she always had one hand that was clenched together really, really tight. And I just remember thinking, I have got to wash this hand because it's always clenched like this. So I unpried her fingers. And as I did, a swarm of maggots just fell out of her hand. And I mean, hundreds of maggots. And I just stopped everything. And I just looked at Ruthie, and she's just looking right at me with one of her eyes crossed and one looking straight at me. And I just said, God, where are you? And it was at that moment that I remembered one time what Jesus himself said. He said, when you have done it to one of the least of these, when you have fed and clothed and helped the least of these, meaning the most oppressed and the vulnerable and the poor, when you have done that to them, you have actually done it to me. And so, can I tell you that in those few moments when I'm looking at Ruthie, my life was being radically altered, because I realized, I was going to the orphanage every day thinking, wow, Ruthie, she has special needs, and so she's so privileged that I'm coming here to help her, that I'm this girl from America and I get to do these things to help her. But you know what? It was a complete role reversal. I realized that I was the one that was in the position of honor and privilege because I got to go every day to help Ruthie. Ruthie, who couldn't talk. She couldn't say a word. She never said thank you. She never said, I'm so glad you came. She couldn't say anything. I was the one that was so honored and privileged to spend time with this beautiful girl every day. Well, my summer sadly ended. I had to come back. I had to go back to school, and I even called my dad. I said, Dad, I don't care if I finish college. I don't even care. I have to stay here. I have to take care of Ruthie. And he was like, get your butt back home. So I had to get on the plane, go back to Arkansas, finish my degree at the University of Arkansas. But unfortunately, after I left, the director of the orphanage put a lock on Ruthie's door so that nobody could go in and she could never come out. My friends found a hole in her window and were trying to feed her through the window. But eventually, Ruthie did die. And she died of starvation at 15 years old. So you can imagine, as a college student, this really was wrecking a lot of things I had in my mind about how I thought the world should run. And I was really upset. I mean, I battled with depression, with anger, with bitterness, you name it. I went through every emotion possible thinking about what happened to Ruthie. But I remember several years later, I actually came across a proverb that made it make sense to me. And here's what the proverb says. It says, a poor man's field may produce abundant food, but injustice sweeps it away. And this is why the definition of the abuse of power over others to take away from them their life and their liberty and their dignity, that's what injustice is. So I came to understand, you know what? It wasn't God that was starving and mistreating Ruthie. It was people that were in positions of power over her that took that away from her because they did not believe she deserved life and dignity. But here's what's hopeful about this particular proverb, is that if people can be in positions of power to take away, then that means I can be in a position of power to give. I can be in a position of power to give life and liberty and dignity to others. Well, as you know, this reality of injustice is a stark realization for millions of people in the world today. And just as Ruthie, little girl, was rotting away in her little room in an orphanage, millions of people today are rotting in brick factories, in rock quarries, in mines, in cocoa plants, in prisons, and in brothels. And I've actually brought an example of that. We have some bricks that we are actually going to pass around. I remember I was at a meeting with IJM at one point, and their director of investigations had just come back from South Asia, and he actually brought a brick from a brick kiln. And I was just astounded at how heavy the brick was. Millions of people today are living as bonded slaves working in brick factories. So what we're going to do tonight is we are going to actually pass a brick around. And here's what I want you to do. When you take a hold of the brick, I want you just to think about for a few seconds, feel the weight of it. These bricks weigh about 10 pounds, which is about how much the bricks weigh. I want you to imagine carrying this brick 10 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, in the scorching sun, with no breaks, with no Band-Aids, with no food, with no pain medication. You might even be raped. You will certainly be abused. And then try to imagine, and maybe you want to hold it on your head, try to imagine putting 10 of these on your head. And then try to imagine that you are as young as 5 years old. There are millions of young children that are forced today to work in brick factories. Recently, IJM's youngest client from a brick factory was 2 years old, a little child that had to sit and turn the bricks over all day long. Well, IJM has put a video together. It's called The End of Slavery, and it's a documentary about 30 minutes long that we're just showing on campuses all across the country, and it highlights this stark reality of modern-day slavery. So we're actually going to watch a few minutes of it together tonight, and you will actually see people that are working in brick factories. So when you're watching them, imagine the weight of the brick. So we're going to show that video right now.
About 10 years old, tiny young girl came up, just above my waist, and she had been sold into prostitution. Her worldview had been shaped by these years that she'd spent at the mercy of these terribly abusive people. And how do you heal that?
Forced prostitution accounts for a significant portion of the $31 billion industry in human trafficking. The UN reports that after drugs and weapons, human trafficking is the third largest and fastest growing criminal enterprise in the world.
Slavery is when someone has their humanity taken away. They're turned into a thing, a commodity, for sale for sex or used for forced labor. Sometimes by brute violence and coercion, sometimes by manipulation and fraud. But the defining characteristic is dehumanization.
Many forms of child labor thrive across the globe, from the cocoa plantations of Africa to the Syrian brick kilns of India. These children know nothing of school and play. Many won't live to see adulthood. Girls trafficked into brothels will die of AIDS. Boys in fishing villages will drown in their masters' nets. Families held in slavery will see their children die with no access to health care. Slave masters are marginalizing and eliminating generations of children around the globe.
The average price of an average slave through most of human history has been around $40,000 in today's money, whereas today, children can easily be purchased for $30, $40, $50, $100 worldwide. And at that price, they cease being investments, and they start being like a styrofoam cup that are cheap to buy. You use it, you drink out of it, you crumple it up, you throw it away. If the child gets sick, if the child gets injured, it's really easier to just throw them away. Human beings have become disposable, and children are the most disposable of all.
In acts of true desperation, millions accept fraudulent loans designed to entrap them, as well as their children and their children's children. They live as bonded laborers, their lives, their bodies, and their families owned by a master.
All the sort of old pictures you might have had of slavery where there's somebody picking cotton driven by a whip or ancient slaves being driven to make bricks. I have seen people making bricks by hand that are forced to do that, and if they don't, they're going to get beaten. I've seen children doing this for 12, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week in rock quarries of slavery. Men and women working on plantations just as they did 150 years ago. It may have a different disguise today. It might have a different lie behind it, but it's always the same thing. It's people being forced to labor by coercion and violence, and it's massive.
Yes, that is a stark reality for millions of people. And today, this is actually a more recent statistic. There are actually 30 million people today living as slaves in the world. And this is more than any other time in history. If you even combine the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade together, there are more people living as slaves today. Today, there are, 7 billion people in the world? That means that 1 out of about every 233 people in the world today lives as a slave. And every year, 2 million little girls and little boys are sold into the sex slave trade. You know, that number starts over every January, and it just goes on top of the year before. Every year, 2 million. And up to 600,000 to 800,000 people are trafficked across international borders every year. And that's actually a big piece of the human trafficking industry, is taking people across international borders. Because what happens is they get to another country, they have no way of escape. They can't speak the language, they have their identity taken away. and they are stuck. I just was reading just the other day a Johns Hopkins report on human trafficking, and this report revealed that every year into the European Union alone, 500,000 people are trafficked into the EU every year. And 80% of human trafficking victims are women. And 50% of those are minors, meaning 18 years of age and younger. And this trade of human trafficking is a $32 billion industry. It is now tied with illegal arms industry as the #2 criminal industry in the world, right under drug trafficking. But it is the fastest growing. And think about it. You know, when somebody uses a drug, you use it one time and it's gone. You have to get more. But with humans, like the film said, they can be used over and over and over again. And would you believe that $32 billion is more than the net profits of Nike and Google and Starbucks combined? This is a massive industry. And like he said, in the mid-1800s, when slavery was legal, people were buying slaves for about $40,000. But today, a child who has unbelievable value and who is priceless can be bought as little as $30. A few years ago, Dateline NBC actually traveled with IJM to Cambodia because they wanted to document the work that IJM was doing. And they went to a town called Sveipak, Cambodia, that was notorious for child sex slavery. And they actually aired this documentary on TV. And so we're actually going to watch a few minutes of it. And the reason that I want you to see this is because I think it highlights just the darkness of what this industry is and how this is happening and what is happening to millions of children around the world. So we're going to watch a few minutes of this documentary right now.
She says it's happening all over the country, but there's one place that is notorious, a rundown village on the outskirts of Phnom Penh. Any taxi driver can tell you it's the place to go if you're looking for the youngest girls.
A young girl.
All youngest, the 11 kilometer.
What's the name of that place?
Sveipak.
Sveipak. It's a 20-minute drive, and we're on a dirt road dotted with cafes and gated storefronts. It takes just a second for a pimp to approach.
Hey, man. Hello.
Hi. How are you?
Yeah.
Everyone in Sveipak assumes we're here for sex. When we sit down at one of the cafes, we're greeted by a young hustler named Paul.
You good. Too much for you.
Okay. Too much.
No, too much girl, too much. After I told you that is young.
He's only 15, but already a real operator. He tells us he's grown up in the village and introduces us to his mother, who knows exactly what he's up to and takes a cut of the money he brings in.
Okay, you keep me, I keep mama.
Paul says he can get us girls who are even younger than the ones we saw at that brothel in the city. And despite all we've seen, we're stunned at just how young he says they are. 8-year-olds. It's hard to believe. He tells us to come see for ourselves. Along with a human rights investigator, we follow Paul through some alleys into a ramshackle house. We think we've already seen it all, but who could be prepared for this? Girls, some so young it could be in kindergarten, all for sale. Throughout the village, we see the same scene at one brothel after another. Everyone here seems to know a little English. When they talk about sex, they use simple, childlike terms anyone can understand.
Boom, boom, yum, yum.
Yeah, boom, boom, yum, yum.
Yum yum means oral sex. Boom boom means intercourse.
I look, huh?
We meet dozens of children. This girl says she's 9.
Yum yum.
Yum yum.
Yeah, yum yum. No, no.
No, too young.
Yum yum.
She knows how yum yum.
She's joined by another who says she's 10. Both say they know how to perform oral sex. And they even tell us how much it will cost.
Hey, you want to go Saturday?
Oh, you doing over here? Bill 30 and 2 girls?
60.
That's 60 American dollars. The pimp says if 2 girls aren't enough, how about 3?
Tiger, happy, happy, happy New Year. Happy, happy.
How much 3 girls?
Tiger 90.
This girl promises we'll be happy.
After you, even you like another friend.
Our team then leaves, saying we may come back later. In the car, the grim reality has set in for human rights investigator Bob Mosier. In 20 years as a cop, he says he's never seen anything like this.
You have an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old little girl who is looking at you smiling, okay, realizing that you're going to, in just a few moments, probably engage in a sexual act that they're going to give money for. And they're smiling about it. I mean, I see a smile like that on my kid's face when they're find out that they're going to go to Disney World or something like that.
But the tourists in Svay Park are a far cry from the ones you see at Disney World, and they're not anxious to talk about why they're here. In a back alley, our producers run into this visitor from Europe.
So what do you do down here, Chief?
I'm a friend there. Did eat.
You come down to Sway Park to eat?
No, it's nice, just a nice area.
Yeah.
But a human rights investigator with a hidden camera found a visitor who was willing to admit he's not here for the scenic beauty or the local cuisine.
Okay, it's the first time here? Yeah. Okay. Come here for a second. Yeah.
When the camera was hidden, this American prowling Svay Park was happy to brag about his exploits.
Usually I buy out three girls for $50. Take them for the whole night. So I just
Look familiar? He should. He's Jerry Albom, the same American doctor we met up with on our arrival in Phnom Penh. And now we know for sure he's interested in more than this country's historic temples.
Yeah, believe it or not, that was a doctor from Oklahoma. But you can be glad to know that he was actually prosecuted and is serving time right now. You can actually see this entire documentary actually just on YouTube. If you just even go to YouTube and look up International Justice Mission, Dateline, NBC, it should just pop right up and you can watch the whole thing. It's about 45 minutes long. But let me tell you, it ends on a very high note. And here is why. They actually were able to do raids, IJM was, after all of this investigative work that they did. And these are the young girls that were actually rescued. All of these girls were taken out, rescued from just the hell that they were living in. They were taken to aftercare where they are now thriving. And there were many people that were held to account. You can see here are 6 perpetrators that were arrested, and they are now facing sentences and are in prison actually from anywhere from 5 to 20 years in prison. And here is what's really disgusting, but interesting to me, is that this is actually a website from a pedophile webpage, and it says basically, stay away from Svay Park, because you will get in big trouble if you go here. So what we can learn from this is that when the rule of law is established and when the rule of law is obeyed, people can live in freedom. Because when the perpetrators go to prison and they have to face the consequence of what they do, then we have found through studies that it literally brings the crime rate down. But the problem in the world is simply that the laws are not simply being enforced. And here is some really good news. Slavery has been beaten before. The great abolitionists of the past fought so hard to make certain that laws were created to make slavery outlawed, and those things passed. And what's interesting is sometimes I think, what would I have done if I had lived back in those days? When I think sometimes in the past, when I think about the great moral struggles of the day, I often wonder, how would I have fared? In the mid-1800s, what if I had lived in Britain while William Wilberforce and his Clapham sect was fighting against the slave trade? Would I have been his friend? Would I have been his confidant? Or would I have been like many, many people in the middle class during that time who just chose to live in oblivion and said and did nothing? Or I think back to the Civil War. If I had lived back in those days, would I have been shoulder to shoulder with Harriet Tubman when she secreted the slaves on the Underground Railroad? Or would I have been left paralyzed with fear and moral confusion and apathy? I love this picture. When I think about Martin Luther King Jr., I wonder this: would I have walked beside him and his fellow civil rights activist? Or would I have been one of just many people, particularly in the South where I'm from, that were paralyzed and that just said, it's just the way things are. Let's don't stir the waters. Would that have been me? I often ask myself. I know this can seem like pure speculation, but I think that it grants us the opportunity to ask ourselves this question: why am I sitting in the seat that I'm sitting in? And I want to ask you that tonight. Why are you sitting in the seats that you're sitting in? Why were you given the privilege and the freedom to be a student or maybe a professor right here at Purdue University? To live in freedom, to even get to choose what you want to study, then to even get to decide what you want to do after school. Do you know that all of us sitting in this room tonight are undeniably some of the most powerful people that have ever walked the globe in all of history? We have abilities and rights and freedoms that most of the world longs to have. Even the fact that we get to be voting citizens, think about it. We get to vote in the world's major superpower who we want to be in leadership. Can I tell you that the majority of people in the world would long to be able to do something like that? To get to vote, to get to debate, to get to have those discussions. But yet, do you ever feel, like I do, a great sense of powerlessness? Maybe when you watch videos like this, or you hear about the fact that 2 million boys and girls are sold into slavery and 30 million people are living in slavery, that it's a massive industry. Do you ever feel powerless when you think about that? I know it's easy for me to do that. And what happens is that that sense of powerlessness actually leads to paralysis. And it makes me think of what Edmund Burke once said. He said, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And my challenge to you this weekend, as you hear statistics and as you're going to hear stories from Melissa, and as you'll hear a debate and dialogue tomorrow, and you'll hear from other speakers tomorrow night, my challenge to you is to not go away and do nothing. Because there are things that you can do, that each one of us can do. Tonight we can respond. And there is hope, because there are actually great things happening. Would you believe that just in the last few years alone, IJM has been able to rescue more than 3,200 children and women and men from slavery? And more than 1,500 women and children in just the last few years have been rescued from sex trafficking. More than 300 individuals have been arrested as perpetrators against these crimes. And thousands of students have taken a stand all across the country and all across the world to say, you know what? We are going to end it. This does not have to be. You may remember when I started, I was sharing the story of Suhana, that she had been re-trafficked to a city far away where she was being raped and abused and exploited day after day and night after night. And although Suhana was re-trafficked, she was not forgotten. IJM was determined to find her. And would you believe that after months and months of investigative leads, they determined that Suhana had actually been trafficked from Kolkata to hundreds of miles away to Mumbai, a city of millions of people. After all of these months of investigative leads, would you believe that in a city of 18 million people, in a red light district of 10 to 15,000 sex workers, one girl was found? They were able to pinpoint Suhana's location, and they rescued her again out of her nightmare of the brothel that she had been living in. Suhana now lives in freedom, and she's even studying in school today and hopes to become a social worker. Her perpetrators have been arrested and are facing now 7 to 10 years in prison for their crimes. And I think it's just such a great testimony, and nobody says it better than Suhana. She said, I'm so thankful that I was rescued because I just represent thousands of young girls who are trafficked, but who have been found. And I think that her story paints a perfect picture of why this matters. And students, I just want you to know, as college students, you are at the prime of your life. You have so many opportunities. You have freedoms, you have abilities, you have mental capacities to where you can use your abilities and your talents to help a hurting and oppressed world. People who are crying out for somebody to help them, somebody to rescue them. And there are ways that you can show up. You can use your degree to help the most vulnerable in the world, whatever that degree is. You can use your time as a student right now to launch justice movements, to raise awareness about trafficking, to use your skills and your abilities to help in this fight, because we believe that this can end. This can happen in this generation. And another thing that you can do is also join the movement. We actually also have a text to get more information. And what you can do is you can also just take out your phone and you can text 80077 and just type in the word justice, and you will join a movement of hundreds and thousands of students who want to be a part of making this all possible. So I encourage you to do that. You can do it right now. You can do it sometime later. But 80077, type in justice, and you will be getting information on what is going on, how you can stay involved in this fight to end trafficking. We also have a website called Freedom 58 Project, where we are wanting to provide resources for you to help you be a part of ending slavery in this generation. You know, for most of us in the room tonight, most of us be someday grandmas and grandpas. Maybe some in the room already are. But I like to think about it like this. Think of it years from now when you're a grandma or grandpa, and your grandchild is asking you this question. They say, hey, where were you back in the day when the most vulnerable in the world were crying out for justice? And when they used to say that there were 30 million people living in slavery. Where were you during that time? I hope that every one of us can say that we showed up and that we showed up on time. Thank you very much.
Thanks for making us aware of such a vast problem, Libby. I couldn't help but thinking as we began contemplating the single death of Andrew Bolt at Purdue, the shooting, and then hearing all of these massive statistics. Stalin once said, "One death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic." It's easy to gather around one person that puts flesh on the bones, but that huge number seems impossible to do anything about. It's so intimidating, we just want to turn a blind eye and look the other way. But you've given us hope, you've given us encouragement that things can happen, we can combat this injustice.